Senate Banking Committee for the first time as SEC chair. In the spotlight, cryptocurrencies and whether the sector could face new regulations under President Biden. Right off the bat, Gensler said he does not think the U.S. has enough investor protections in crypto finance.
I think it's more like the Wild West. I've asked the SEC staff, working with our fellow regulators, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the bank regulators, the Treasury as well, using our current authorities, how can we best bring investor protection to these markets?
Joining us now is Banking Committee ranking member Senator Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania. He questioned the SEC chair yesterday, and good to see you today, Senator. Thanks for being here.
Morning, Becky. Thanks for having me.
Look, I have to say, Gary Gensler is a very serious guy on these matters. MIT educator, or former professor on some of these things, was teaching classes on this. You're very serious about these issues, too, and yet you don't see eye to eye with some of these issues. You're both people I take seriously, though. What do you fault Gary Gensler on when it comes to some of these things?
Yeah, so if you listen to the exchange that I had with Chairman Gensler yesterday, a big part of it was the fact that the SEC has not laid out clear guidelines on what kinds of cryptocurrencies they view as securities, right? Their regulatory regime is limited to securities and platforms that trade securities. Well, if cryptocurrencies, or at least certain cryptocurrencies, are not securities, then the SEC doesn't currently have legislative authority to regulate them. Now, maybe you can make a case that we ought to change that. We can have that conversation. But here's what concerns me. Chairman Gensler will acknowledge that, say, Bitcoin and Ethereum certainly are not securities. Certainly they look more like commodities. He'll acknowledge that. But then he'll say that stable coins pretty much are securities. But if you ask me, they don't actually meet the test, the legal test for what constitutes a security. So I'm just asking the SEC to provide some clarity. Let us know. Why do you think this is a security? What are the characteristics of a cryptocurrency that make it a security so that people will know? And then let the laws, enforce the laws. Maybe we need to make some changes. I'm not in the camp that thinks that there should never be any kind of regulation over any cryptocurrency. That's not my position at all. But I do think there needs to be transparency and objectivity about what we're doing here. And the SEC is taking enforcement actions without first having laid out how they interpret, how they apply existing securities law to this really, really important and innovative new category of finance.
Innovative it is, and it's been hard for the regulators to keep up. You understand that, it often is hard for regulators to keep up with the pace of innovation. He makes a point in saying it's the wild, wild west out there. I mean, we saw earlier this week the Litecoin situation, that fake release that went out and said that Walmart was going to start accepting it. And it does make you look at this and say, hey, maybe there is some regulatory oversight that's needed, and maybe it'll take a little too long. I can kind of see him laying down his place markers as a way to get to just a signal that, hey, there's something coming, so you better sit up and pay a little more attention.
Yeah, look, I think it is a little bit of the Wild West, and there's no doubt some of these projects are going to end badly. There's some of these projects are offering returns that don't make sense to me. It's hard for me to imagine how they are sustainable. All of that, I think, is true. But I think it's also the case that the SEC owes Americans generally, and certainly everybody in this space, the transparency of saying, here's how we're looking at this. Here's why we think this category is a security, and we're going to regulate it as such. These are not securities, and they have to either be unregulated or regulated somewhere else. The cash market for commodities are not federally regulated. CFTC regulates futures. The SEC regulates securities. Of course, we have multiple bank regulators. But, we've got to sort this out, and we ought to have transparency before we go with enforcement.
Let me ask you about one issue that came out. Let me change it around to do it this way. What do you agree with Gary Gensler on? Are there areas where you say, okay, he's right on this?
I think there are certainly products that are being offered that look an awful lot like securities or mutual funds or money market accounts, and there ought to be comparable regulatory regimes over comparable products. I think Gary Gensler and I would agree with that. We agree that some of the most popular cryptocurrencies in the world are certainly not securities. Bitcoin is not a security. Ethereum is not a security. Gary Gensler agrees with that. So there's actually considerable overlap. I think we got a little bit of a struggle on what he considers to be securities and why.
And is there another place that you would think would potentially have more oversight? Are you thinking the CFTC because you think it looks more like a commodity or something else?
Well, they really are responsible for futures, and they don't necessarily look like commodity futures. So, no, look, I do think the regulators are working on this, and they're trying to there are various working groups that are trying to get together and decide, what do these new instruments look most like, and how should they be regulated. And I think that's a conversation that needs to happen, and Congress obviously needs to be involved. There might be a requirement, there might be a need for some new legislation. But I just want to make sure that we proceed very, very cautiously. I don't happen to have a view on the value of a given token, but I do have a view that the value of the underlying technology is enormous. It's going to transform finance. It's going to do wonderful things for consumers generally, and I don't want us to stifle the innovation that's coming out of this space.
Have you or your staff heard back from either the commissioner or his office on any of these things, just in terms of saying, okay, as you pointed out, they will say to you behind closed doors privately, here's what we think looks like a security, here's what we don't. Have they given you any indication about when they might actually make that public to others?
Not exactly, no. I've had multiple conversations privately and publicly with Chairman Gensler. I'm working on trying to get that clarity. I mean, his position will be, well, there's enough clarity about what the law says. I don't think that's true when you apply it to this category. And that's part of the disagreement that we're having.
Let's talk about what we've seen from the Ways and Means draft now on the tax bill and how that might be able to work its way through the Senate or not. What do you think the biggest sticking points are in terms of being able to pass that through the Senate?
Well, look, it's horrifying to me when you look at the massive tax increase that that they have laid out, and then the hit it's going to have on small business. Completely doing away with the 20% deduction that small businesses. We put that into the 2017 tax reform to create some kind of rough parity between pass-through small businesses and C corps, which got an explicit tax reduction, right? A rate reduction in the corporate rate. That's a huge problem. I got to believe that's going to be a source of resistance. But as you know, ultimately, this is a strictly party line, partisan exercise. And the question is going to be, what can the Democratic traffic bear, both in the House and in the Senate? And I don't know the answer to that. I don't think anybody does yet. We've got the Biden administration has floated their plan. The Ways and Means has theirs. And Senate Finance has still yet another raft of massive tax increases. How they sort through all this and settle on something that can hold every last Democrat senator and almost every single Democrat House member, I don't know how they're going to do that.
One thing that a lot of people haven't maybe paid much attention to is the wash sale rules that are in the House Ways and Means version of this that would say that for any cryptocurrencies, for any commodities, for any currencies, that if you were to sell them immediately, you couldn't buy them back and then still get the tax benefits from taking a loss on any of those things. That seems to make sense, especially when you're dealing with something that's so volatile like a cryptocurrency. Would you at least sign off on something like that?
So I thought we had some existing wash sale rules, and I'm not sure how exactly they intend to change it. So I'm not familiar with the details of that particular provision. That's pretty deep in the weeds. And one of the
things, a lot of stuff deep in the weeds here. The more I read, the more I find.
You're right. And the thing of it is, Becky, we don't know whether that's going to survive on the Senate side. We don't know whether it even survives in the House. This is just a draft that's been released by the Committee of Jurisdiction in the House. So I'm not sure how that's going to play out in the end.
The more I read, the more I'm surprised by it. But yes, I think we will have many of these conversations. Senator Toomey, thanks for being with us today. It's good to see you.
Thanks for having me, Becky.